The strangest thing about kindness is that sometimes the wrong person notices it. The wind cut through the concrete pillars beneath the overpass like a blade made of ice, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and distant traffic across the narrow stretch of pavement where Grace Morgan stood beside a folding table. The December sky hung low over Manhattan, grey and heavy, threatening snow that never seemed to arrive. Her fingers were numb despite the gloves, her feet hurt. She had been there for almost 6 hours. But the line in front of her still hadn't disappeared. Families, veterans, elderly men pushing shopping carts filled with everything they owned. Teenagers pretending not to be embarrassed. Children trying to smile even when their jackets were too thin for the cold. Grace forced warmth into her voice anyway. "Careful, it's hot." She handed a paper container of soup to a woman carrying a sleeping toddler. The woman thanked her softly before moving away. Another person stepped forward, then another, then another. The city never seemed to run out of people who needed help. By 7 o'clock, the sun had disappeared completely. Orange streetlights flickered to life above the overpass, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Volunteers began packing supplies into vans. Empty cardboard boxes scraped against concrete. Someone folded tables. Someone counted donations. Grace checked the insulated containers one last time. One meal remained. Just one. She stared at it for a moment and sighed. Usually they planned better. Usually they never ran out before everyone was served. A gust of cold air swept through the underpass. That's when she noticed the boy. He couldn't have been older than 8, maybe 9. He stood near one of the support columns wearing sneakers held together by duct tape. His hands were shoved deep inside the pockets of an oversized coat. He wasn't approaching the table. He wasn't asking for anything. Grace walked toward him. "Hey." The boy looked away immediately. "You hungry?" He shrugged. The kind of shrug children learned when disappointment happened too often. Grace knelt slightly so she wouldn't tower over him. "What's your name, Ethan?" His voice was barely audible. Grace smiled. "Well, Ethan, looks like you're in luck." She held out the final meal. The boy stared at it, then at her. "What about you?" Grace laughed softly. "Trust me, I'll survive." After several seconds, Ethan accepted the container with both hands. The steam rose into the cold night air between them. For the first time, the boy smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It wasn't dramatic, but it transformed his entire face. Grace felt something tighten in her chest. Moments like that were the reason she kept coming back. Not because she could fix everything, not because she could save everyone, but because sometimes one warm meal mattered. Ethan hurried away, disappearing into the shadows beyond the overpass. Grace stood and watched until he was gone. Then she rubbed her hands together and turned toward the parking lot. That's when she noticed the SUV, black, expensive, parked across the street beneath a flickering street lamp. It hadn't been there earlier, or maybe she simply hadn't paid attention. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. The engine remained running. White exhaust drifted into the freezing air. She frowned briefly before returning to help the remaining volunteers. 10 minutes later, the tables were gone. The vans had left. The area beneath the overpass sat quiet except for the distant roar of traffic overhead. Grace zipped her coat and adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag. When she looked across the street again, the SUV was still there, watching, waiting. She couldn't explain why the sight made her uneasy. Maybe it was the way the vehicle never moved. Maybe it was because nobody ever stayed in this neighborhood after dark unless they had a reason. Grace shook the thought away and started walking toward the subway entrance 2 blocks away. Behind her, the black SUV remained motionless beneath the streetlight. What she didn't know was that the man sitting inside had spent the last 3 hours watching every person walk through that line, and out of hundreds of faces he remembered only one. As Grace disappeared into the city crowd, the man finally spoke for the first time that night. "Find out who she is." By the following Tuesday morning, the cold had settled over Manhattan like a heavy blanket. Frost clung to parked cars. Breath lingered in the air. Inside the small community center where Grace Morgan worked, the heating system rattled louder than usual as volunteers moved folding chairs and stacked donation boxes against the walls. The building was old, underfunded, and constantly one repair bill away from disaster, but it was still one of the few places in the neighborhood where people could walk through the doors without being asked what they could afford. Grace balanced a clipboard against her hip while reviewing supply numbers for the weekend meal program. The figures were not encouraging. They needed more food, more blankets, more winter coats, more everything. She rubbed her forehead and stared at the spreadsheet again, hoping the numbers would somehow improve on their own. They never did. A sudden voice pulled her attention away. "Grace, you need to see this." One of the volunteers hurried toward her carrying a large envelope, thick cream-colored paper, no return address, no logo, nothing. Grace accepted it with a puzzled expression and carefully opened the seal. Several documents slid into her hands. Her eyes moved across the first page, then stopped, then went back to the beginning. "What is it?" the volunteer asked. Grace did not answer immediately. She simply stared. The donation amount printed across the page was larger than the center's annual operating budget. Much larger. Enough to expand programs, enough to repair the building, enough to keep every shelter initiative running through the entire winter. The room seemed to go quiet around her. "Is that real?" another volunteer asked. The banking information appeared legitimate. The legal documents were complete. Every signature was in place. "I think it is," she said softly. The volunteers exchanged stunned looks. A few seconds later, cheers erupted throughout the room. Someone laughed. Someone cried. One woman covered her mouth with both hands. Months of uncertainty seemed to disappear in an instant. Yet Grace felt something unexpected. Relief, yes. Gratitude, certainly, but also confusion. The donation was anonymous. No explanation, no conditions, no publicity request, nothing. It felt almost impossible. By late afternoon, news of the contribution had spread through the organization. Phone calls filled the office. Local partners wanted confirmation, board members wanted meetings, everyone wanted answers Grace did not have. As evening approached, she finally stepped outside for fresh air. The winter sun was sinking behind rows of brick buildings, painting the city in shades of gold and grey. Traffic crawled through the streets. Pedestrians hurried past with scarves pulled tight against the wind. Grace leaned against the railing outside the center and closed her eyes for a moment. Then she noticed him, across the street, standing beside a black SUV, the same vehicle she had seen beneath the overpass. Her stomach tightened. The man wore a dark overcoat and leather gloves. Tall, calm, perfectly still despite the cold. People flowed around him like water moving around stone. He was not looking at his phone. He was not speaking to anyone. He was simply watching the building, watching her. Grace straightened immediately. The distance between them was nearly half a city block, yet something about his presence felt impossible to ignore. Before she could decide whether to walk over, a delivery truck rolled through the intersection and briefly blocked her view. When it passed, the man was already entering the SUV. The door closed. The vehicle pulled away smoothly and disappeared into traffic. Grace stood frozen for several seconds. She told herself it was coincidence. New York was full of strangers, full of expensive cars, full of people passing through each other's lives without meaning. Yet she could not shake the feeling that she had seen him before. Less than a mile away, seated in the back of that departing SUV, Sebastian Romano reviewed a file containing every available detail about Grace Morgan. Her volunteer history, her work records, her apartment lease, her financial statements. Every page confirmed what he had already suspected. She was exactly who she appeared to be, honest, compassionate, unimpressed by money. For the first time in years, something resembling curiosity crossed his face. Outside the tinted window, the city lights flickered to life one by one. Inside the vehicle, Sebastian closed the file and looked ahead. "Prepare a meeting," he said quietly. "I want to speak with her personally." Some people change your life long before they ever say a single word to you. 3 days after the anonymous donation arrived, Grace Morgan found herself standing beneath crystal chandeliers she could never have imagined paying for. The charity fundraising event occupied the entire ballroom of a historic Manhattan hotel overlooking the East River. Soft piano music drifted through the room. Glasses clinked gently. Conversations floated beneath golden light. Everywhere she looked, there were tailored suits, designer dresses, and people discussing numbers larger than most families earned in a year. Grace adjusted the sleeve of her simple navy dress and tried not to feel out of place. The event organizers had insisted she attend. The community center's recent success had suddenly made them interesting, important, visible. It still felt strange. 6 months earlier, nobody had returned her calls. Tonight, people introduced themselves before she could even reach the refreshment table. She smiled politely through each conversation, answered questions about outreach programs, and accepted compliments that felt directed toward the donation rather than the work itself. By 8 o'clock she was exhausted. She stepped onto a quieter balcony overlooking the river. Cold air greeted her immediately. The skyline stretched across the dark water like a field of stars. For the first time all evening she could hear herself think, "You look like someone planning an escape." The voice came from behind her, deep, calm, caught slightly. The man standing there was the same man she had seen beside the black SUV, Up close he appeared even more striking, tall, dark overcoat, sharp features. The kind of crowded ballroom behind him seemed distant and insignificant. Maybe I was, Grace admitted. A faint smile touched his face. Then I apologized for interrupting. For a moment neither spoke. Traffic lights reflected across the river below. Wind tugged gently at Grace's hair. I have seen you before, she finally said. I suspected you might. His answer came too quickly. Grace narrowed her eyes slightly. Have we met? Not officially. There was something unusual about the way he spoke. Not arrogant, not flirtatious, simply certain, like a man accustomed to answers. I am Sebastian Romano. The name meant nothing to Grace. Yet several guests passing through the balcony doors immediately glanced toward him before continuing on. Their reactions did not go unnoticed. Grace Morgan, I know. The words slipped out naturally. Then he paused. For the first time all evening, he seemed to realize how that sounded. Grace laughed softly. That is either impressive or concerning, hopefully impressive. The corner of her mouth lifted despite herself. Something about him made conversation surprisingly easy. He asked questions about the community center, the shelter program, the children she worked with. Unlike most donors, he seemed interested in details, real details, which neighborhoods needed help, which programs failed, which families slipped through the cracks. He listened carefully to every answer, not pretending. Actually 20 minutes. Grace found herself forgetting the ballroom entirely. You know a lot about this work, she said. Sebastian looked out toward the river. More than most people assume. Silence settled briefly between them. Then he asked a question that immediately changed the atmosphere. If funding was no longer a problem, what would you build first? Grace blinked. What? No limitations, no budget meetings, no waiting lists. What would you build, she considered the question. A permanent youth center. For homeless children, for children who need somewhere safe to belong. Sebastian studied her expression carefully. Interesting. Why? Most people answer with buildings. His gaze remained fixed on the water. You answered with purpose. Before Grace could respond, a group of guests approached from inside the ballroom. Their reaction was immediate, respectful, careful, almost cautious. One older businessman stopped beside Sebastian. Sir, the board is ready whenever you are. Sir, not Mr., not Sebastian, sir. Grace noticed the subtle shift. The businessman was waiting for permission rather than making a request. Sebastian nodded once. The man immediately stepped back. A strange feeling settled in Grace's stomach. She suddenly realized that everyone who passed seemed aware of exactly who Sebastian Romano was. Everyone except her. Sebastian turned back toward her. I hope this is not our last conversation. Grace folded her arms against the cold wind. That depends. On what? Whether you finally explain why I keep running into you. For the first time, genuine amusement appeared in his eyes. Then he reached into his coat pocket and handed her a simple black business card. No company logo, no title, only a phone number and his name. Grace looked down at it. When she raised her eyes again, Sebastian was already stepping back toward the ballroom doors. Call me when you are ready to save more children than you ever thought possible. And before Grace could ask what he meant, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving her alone with the card and a question that refused to leave her mind. The business card sat on Grace Morgan's kitchen table for 4 days before she finally picked it up. Every morning she told herself she would throw it away. Every evening she found another reason not to. Outside her apartment window, Manhattan moved with its usual restless energy. Sirens echoed in the distance. Steam rose from street grates. Lights flickered across neighboring buildings. Life continued. Yet the card remained exactly where she left it. On Friday afternoon, after another exhausting meeting about overcrowded shelters and shrinking resources, she finally dialed the number. The call connected on the first ring. Grace. Sebastian Romano's voice sounded calm, as though he had been expecting her call all week. She frowned slightly. How did you know it was me? A brief pause. Because very few people have that number. Grace rolled her eyes despite herself. That is not actually an answer. Fair enough. She heard the faint hint of amusement in his voice. Would you like to have dinner? The answer came immediately. Good. Another pause. Because that is not why I wanted to meet. Grace blinked. Then why did you? Tomorrow? 10 o'clock. I will send a car. Before she could protest, the call ended. The next morning arrived cold and clear. Grace almost cancelled 3 separate times, yet curiosity eventually won. At exactly 10 o'clock, a black SUV waited outside her building. The same vehicle, the same polished exterior, the same driver in a dark suit. Manhattan unfolded beyond the tinted windows as they crossed town. The neighborhoods changed gradually. Small storefronts became glass towers. Crowded sidewalks became quiet avenues lined with luxury buildings. 20 minutes later, the SUV entered a private underground garage beneath one of the tallest residential towers in the city. Grace stepped out and followed an assistant toward a private elevator. The ride upward seemed endless. When the doors finally opened, she found herself staring at an entire floor wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows. Sunlight flooded the space. The skyline stretched in every direction. The Hudson River shimmered beneath the winter sky. It felt less like an apartment and more like a command center floating above the city. Sebastian stood near the windows with his hands in his coat pockets. "Thank you for coming." Grace looked around carefully. "You live here?" "Sometimes." "That is the most suspicious answer anyone has ever given me." To her surprise, he laughed. The sound transformed him briefly. Softer, more human, he gestured toward a large conference table positioned near the center of the room. Architectural renderings covered the surface, maps, financial reports, community development proposals, shelter expansion plans. Grace slowed as she approached. "What is all this?" "A problem." Sebastian stepped beside her. "And potentially a solution." She studied the document. Several neighborhoods were highlighted, areas she knew well, areas filled with families struggling to survive. "You have been researching shelters for months. Why?" Sebastian remained silent for a moment. His gaze drifted toward the city below. "Because writing checks solves less than people think." Grace looked at him carefully. "Then what solves it?" "Leadership." He turned back toward her. "Which is why I asked you here." Grace felt her stomach tighten. "What exactly are you offering?" Inside was a complete proposal. Funding, staffing, real estate, transportation, medical outreach, educational services, numbers so large they barely felt real. Her eyes widened. "This cannot be serious." "It is. This would cost hundreds of millions of dollars." "Yes." Grace slowly closed the folder. "And you want me to do what?" Sebastian met her gaze directly. "Run it." Silence filled the room. Traffic moved silently dozens of stories below. Somewhere behind them, an elevator door opened and closed. Grace searched his expression for signs of a joke. She found none. "You do not even know me." "I know enough. You watched me hand out soup one night. I watched you give away your last meal when nobody was watching." His voice remained calm, certain. "There is a difference." Grace looked away first. The city seemed impossibly large beyond the glass. People with this kind of money usually want something in return. Sebastian's expression did not change. "What I want is results." The answer should have reassured her. Instead, it raised even more questions, because for the first time, Grace began to understand something unsettling. Sebastian Romano was not simply wealthy. Wealthy people asked permission. Wealthy people waited for appointments. Wealthy people negotiated. Everything she had seen suggested that the world moved around him instead. And as she looked across the table at the man offering to change thousands of lives with a single signature, one question echoed louder than all the others. Who exactly was Sebastian Romano? Power rarely announces itself. Most of the time, it reveals itself through the silence that follows a single phone call. Grace Morgan spent the next 2 weeks reviewing proposals, budgets, and development plans that seemed too ambitious to exist outside a political campaign. Yet every number checked out. Every permit appeared obtainable. Every obstacle that normally delayed community projects for months seemed to vanish before it could become a problem. The experience left her both impressed and unsettled. On a grey Monday morning, she stood outside a vacant building in Brooklyn that had been abandoned for nearly a decade. Broken windows lined the upper floors, graffiti-covered sections of brick walls. According to city records, multiple organizations had tried to purchase the property and failed. The location was perfect for a youth center. The problem was that nobody could get approval. At least nobody had until now. Grace adjusted her coat against the cold wind and stared at the building. "There is no way this actually happens," she said. Sebastian Romano stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "You should have more faith. I work in non-profit outreach." She glanced toward him. Faith is usually what people ask for when they cannot provide funding. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, close enough. Before either could continue, a black sedan pulled to the curb. 2 city officials stepped out carrying folders. Grace recognized one immediately. She had spent nearly a year trying to schedule a meeting with him. Every request had been ignored. Now he was walking directly toward them. "Mr. Romano," the official extended his hand. "Everything is prepared." Grace watched the interaction carefully. The official's tone carried none of the impatience she remembered from previous encounters. If anything, he sounded eager. Within 10 minutes, documents were signed, inspections scheduled, approvals expedited. Entire bureaucratic barriers dissolved in front of her eyes. It felt unreal. As the officials departed, Grace folded her arms and stared at Sebastian. Okay, what? Now I am officially concerned. He looked amused. About the building, about you. For the first time that morning, Sebastian laughed openly. The sound echoed softly across the empty street. I was wondering how long it would take. Grace shook her head. Nobody gets things done that quickly. That is not true. Then explain it. Sebastian looked up toward the abandoned building. His expression became thoughtful. Most people spend years asking whether something can be done. And you? I ask, who benefits when it does not get done? The answer lingered between them. Grace studied him carefully. Every conversation seemed to reveal another layer, while somehow explaining nothing. Later that afternoon, they visited a shelter expansion project in Queens. Children ran through hallways that were still under renovation. Volunteers unloaded donated supplies. Construction crews worked beneath bright portable lights. Everywhere they went, people seemed to know Sebastian, not necessarily by name. Sometimes it was a nod, sometimes a respectful greeting. Sometimes simply a shift in posture when he entered a room. The city seemed to bend around him in ways Grace could not fully understand. By evening, they found themselves walking through a nearly completed community center. Sunlight had faded beyond the windows, leaving warm amber light spilling across freshly painted walls. Grace stopped near the entrance and looked around. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine the future. Children filling classrooms, families attending workshops, hot meals served during winter storms. Possibilities instead of shortages. You were right, she admitted toward her. About what? Money is not the solution. He waited. Grace smiled faintly, but it certainly helps. Something softened in his expression. Not pride, not satisfaction, relief, as though her approval mattered more than he intended. Then a voice echoed from the far end of the hallway. Boss. The single word stopped the moment cold. Grace turned automatically. One of Sebastian's associates stood near a doorway, waiting. The man immediately realized she had heard him and looked away, but it was too late. Grace slowly shifted her gaze back towards Sebastian. The silence stretched. Outside, city lights flickered alive beyond the windows. Inside, one simple word suddenly carried more weight than every unanswered question she had been asking for weeks. Boss, she repeated softly, and for the first time since they met, Sebastian Romano did not immediately answer. The truth rarely arrives all at once. Most of the time, it appears in small details that refuse to fit together. The question followed Grace Morgan for the rest of the evening. Boss. The word echoed through her thoughts as she rode home, as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, and even as she stared out her window long after midnight. By itself, the title meant nothing. Plenty of people were called boss, construction supervisors, business owners, managers. Yet something about the way the associate had said it felt different, respectful, careful, almost instinctive. The next morning, Grace tried to focus on work. New funding had accelerated several projects at once. Contractors needed approvals, volunteers needed schedules, outreach teams needed transportation. The pace was exhausting, but it usually helped quiet her thoughts. Usually. Around noon, she found herself reviewing property records connected to future shelter locations. Most of the files were routine: ownership transfers, tax assessments, permit applications. Then one address caught her attention, a large warehouse property near the waterfront that was scheduled to become a temporary winter shelter. Grace recognized the neighborhood immediately. She had worked there for years. Curious, she opened the ownership history. Her eyes moved across the screen, then stopped. The property belonged to a holding company. The holding company belonged to another corporation. That corporation led to a third, and eventually every path ended in the same place: Romano Holdings. Grace leaned back slowly. She searched another location, then another. The pattern repeated: community centers, housing projects, vacant buildings, distribution facilities. Somehow, Sebastian's network seemed connected to nearly everything, not directly, but always present. The realization left her unsettled. Late that afternoon, she visited a neighborhood shelter scheduled for renovation. Snow drifted lightly through the air as she crossed the parking lot. Children played basketball on a cracked outdoor court despite the cold. Volunteers carried boxes through side entrances. Life continued, yet something felt different now. She was beginning to see invisible threads connecting places she once thought were unrelated. Inside the building, an elderly administrator greeted her warmly. They reviewed expansion plans together before walking through several unused sections of the facility. "We are lucky," the administrator said. "Without the new funding, this place probably would not survive another winter." Grace nodded. "Who owned the property before?" The woman smiled faintly. "Same people who own half the neighborhood. Romano Holdings. You know them." Grace hesitated. "A little." The administrator laughed softly. "Most people do not realize it. They keep a low profile. But when buildings need repairs, somehow repairs happen. When programs need support, support appears." She lowered her voice slightly. "People talk. Some say the entire area runs because of them." Grace looked through a nearby window toward the snow-covered street outside. The comment should have sounded ridiculous. Instead, it fit perfectly with everything she had been witnessing. 2 days later, Sebastian invited her to tour another potential project site. This one sat on the edge of an industrial district overlooking the East River. The property stretched across several acres, empty lots, old warehouses, future possibilities. As they walked together beneath grey winter skies, Grace finally asked the question she had been carrying for days. "How much of this city do you actually own?" Sebastian glanced toward her. "Less than people assume." "That is not reassuring. It was not meant to be." Grace sighed. "Every time I learn something new about you, I end up with twice as many questions." For a moment, Sebastian said nothing. Wind swept across the river. Seagulls drifted overhead. "Questions are healthy," he said eventually. "Blind trust is not." The answer surprised her. She had expected deflection. Instead, he sounded almost relieved that she remained skeptical. They continued walking. Ahead of them stood a neglected building scheduled for demolition. Its faded brick walls overlooked a small pre-shelters beneath an elevated roadway. Grace slowed. Something about the location felt familiar. She studied the area carefully. Then her expression changed. The realization arrived instantly. This was the same neighborhood where she had first seen the black SUV, the same place where Sebastian had watched her give away her final meal. And as she looked beyond the empty lot toward the cluster of shelters below, another detail caught her attention. A set of property documents attached to a construction notice listed the Romano Holdings. Grace stared at the sign, then at Sebastian. Suddenly one question mattered more than all the others. How long had he really been watching her? Sometimes the answer to a mystery only creates a larger one. Grace Morgan could not stop looking at the construction notice. The wind tugged at the edges of the paper as it hung against the chain-link fence, but the name remained impossible to miss. Romano Holdings. The same company, the same network that seemed to exist behind every project she touched. Slowly she turned toward Sebastian Romano. He stood a few feet away overlooking the river, calm as ever, as though nothing unusual had happened. "How long?" she asked quietly. Sebastian looked at her. "How long what? How long have you known who I was?" For the first time he did not answer immediately. The silence itself told her enough. "Longer than you would probably like," he admitted. Grace folded her arms against the cold. "That is not a reassuring response, I know." Snow drifted through the grey afternoon air. Barges moved slowly across the river below. Somewhere in the distance a ferry horn echoed across the water. The city felt strangely quiet. "Why me?" Sebastian studied her for a moment before looking away. "Because I was curious." Grace almost laughed. "Nobody spends millions of dollars because they are curious. Most people do not." The answer only deepened her frustration. Before she could continue, Sebastian's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear, not concern, recognition. "I need to make a stop before returning to Manhattan," he said. "You can come if you want." Grace should have declined. Every sensible instinct told her she already had enough unanswered questions. Yet, curiosity won again. 40 minutes later, the SUV left the city behind. Buildings gradually gave way to quieter streets lined with bare wind disappeared. The skyline shrank in the distance. Eventually they arrived at a small neighborhood in Westchester County. The houses were older, modest, well-maintained. Nothing about the area suggested immense wealth or extraordinary power. Sebastian exited the vehicle and began walking toward a narrow residential street. Grace followed. Neither spoke. The late afternoon sun filtered through tree branches overhead, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. After several minutes, Sebastian stopped in front of a small brick house. It looked ordinary. White shutters, small front yard, a wooden porch decorated with winter wreaths. The kind of home thousands of families might pass without noticing. Yet something in Sebastian's expression changed the moment he looked at it. The hardness Grace had grown accustomed to seeing seemed to soften, not disappear, simply fade. You grew up here? She asked. He nodded once. Grace looked at the house again. Somehow she had expected something larger, grander. Instead it felt warm, human, real. Sebastian climbed the porch steps and unlocked the front door. Inside, the house remained almost untouched. Family photographs covered shelves, old books filled cabinets, sunlight streamed through lace curtains, dust floated through the air like tiny pieces of memory. Grace moved carefully through the quiet rooms. Every detail seemed preserved, protected. She saw the photograph. It sat framed on a small table near the living room window. A woman stood smiling beside a folding table filled with food containers. Children surrounded her. Volunteers laughed in the background. The image instantly felt familiar, too familiar. Grace stepped closer, her breath caught. The woman was doing exactly what Grace had been doing beneath the overpass, feeding people, serving meals, looking at strangers as though they mattered. Who is she? Grace asked softly. Sebastian remained near the doorway. The fading sunlight touched the edges of the photograph between them. For several seconds he simply looked at it. Then he answered in a voice quieter than she had ever heard before. My mother. Grace stared at the photograph again. Suddenly dozens of disconnected moments rearranged themselves inside her mind. The donation, the attention, the questions, the impossible opportunities. Yet even now the full picture remained hidden because as she looked closer at the smiling woman in the frame, she realized there was something else. Something important she still did not understand. And judging by the expression on Sebastian's face, the real reason he had brought her here had only just begun to reveal itself. The people who leave the deepest marks on our lives are often the ones we understand last. The house remained quiet as evening settled beyond the windows. Soft orange light stretched across the hardwood floors. Somewhere outside, wind moved through bare tree branches, brushing gently against the glass. Grace Morgan stood beside the photograph, unable to look away from the smiling woman frozen in time. There was something unmistakable in her expression. Not perfection, not idealism. Something simpler. Kindness without calculation, the same look Grace had seen on volunteers serving meals during snowstorms. The same look she remembered from teachers who stayed late for struggling students. The same look she tried to carry into every shelter and community center she entered. Slowly she turned toward Sebastian Romano. He remained near the doorway, hands in his coat pockets. For the first time since meeting him, he looked less like the man who controlled entire city blocks and more like someone carrying an old memory. She volunteered here? Grace asked softly. Sebastian nodded. Every weekend. She believed nobody should eat alone. Grace looked back at the frame. Children crowded around the woman. Volunteers laughed behind folding tables. The image felt alive despite its age. The first time I saw you, Sebastian continued, I was not planning to stop. I had meetings across town, deadlines, decisions, the usual things. A faint smile crossed his face. Then I saw you give away the last meal. The room fell silent again. Grace remembered that night clearly. The cold, the exhausted volunteers, the boy named Ethan. At the time it had felt insignificant, one small choice among thousands she had made over the years. You keep talking about that moment, she said. It was one meal. No. Sebastian shook his head slightly. It was not. Grace frowned. I do not understand. He walked toward a nearby bookshelf and picked up another framed photograph. This one showed the same woman standing beside a younger version of himself, maybe 10 years old, maybe younger. Both were holding paper food containers. When I was a child, he said quietly, my mother used to tell me something. He studied the picture before continuing. She said you learn who people really are when there is only one piece left. Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. Sebastian placed the photograph back on the shelf. Most people become generous when they have plenty. His gaze met hers. Very few stay generous when they have almost nothing left to give. The words lingered between them. The meetings, the opportunities, the attention, everything began fitting together. Not completely, but enough. You saw her, Grace whispered. Sebastian looked away toward the window. The fading sunlight outlined his profile. For a second, his voice had become almost impossibly quiet. When you handed that meal to the boy, I saw her. Grace did not know what to say. Outside, darkness slowly replaced the last traces of daylight. The house seemed suspended between past and present. That is why you chose me. It was not a question. Sebastian remained silent for several seconds. That is why I noticed you. The distinction mattered. Grace understood that immediately. Yet another thought surfaced, one that refused to disappear. You still are not telling me everything. A shadow crossed Sebastian's expression, small, brief, but impossible to miss. Grace felt it instantly. There was more, something he had deliberately left unsaid. Something connected to the photograph, to the house, to the reason this place had remained preserved for so many years. Then her eyes drifted toward a collection of old newspaper clippings displayed beneath a glass frame near the fireplace. One article featured the same woman from the photograph. Grace stepped closer. Her heart began to beat faster, because beneath the smiling image was a headline she had never expected to see. And the moment she read the first line, she realized the story Sebastian had shared was only half of the truth. The most painful truths are rarely hidden. They sit in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to read them. Grace Morgan stood motionless beside the fireplace as her eyes moved across the yellowed newspaper clipping beneath the glass. The article was nearly 15 years old. The photograph showed the same woman she had seen throughout the house, the same warm smile, the same gentle eyes. But the headline told a different story. It described a community kitchen that had closed after funding disappeared. It described families losing access to food programs. It described entire neighborhoods being left behind as development projects transformed sections of the city. Grace read every line twice, then a third time. Slowly she looked up. "This happened here?" Sebastian Romano nodded once. The room felt smaller now. The warmth she had sensed throughout the house seemed overshadowed by something heavier. Regret, history, consequences. Grace returned her attention to the article. Several names appeared repeatedly. Development groups, property investors, corporate partnerships. The language was polite, professional, yet the outcome was impossible to ignore. Programs closed, families suffered, communities changed. "Your mother fought against this," Grace said quietly. "Yes, and she lost." Sebastian's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes." Silence settled between them. Outside, darkness pressed gently against the windows. The house remained still except for the faint ticking of an old clock somewhere deeper inside. Grace looked toward the photographs again. "Then why does it feel like you are only telling half the story?" Sebastian walked toward the window. His reflection appeared faintly against the glass. "Because the other half is not something I am proud of." Grace waited. For once, she did not push. She simply waited. Eventually, Sebastian spoke. "The companies in that article no longer exist. What happened to them?" They became something else. Grace felt a slow knot forming in her stomach. She already knew the answer before he said it. Romano Holdings. Sebastian did landed quietly, but its weight was enormous. Grace looked back at the article, then at the photographs, then at the man standing across the room. Suddenly the contradiction became impossible to ignore. The same organization now funding shelters had once benefited from decisions that harmed communities like the ones she served. The same network helping families today had played a role in creating hardships years earlier. "You knew," she said, "from the beginning." Sebastian nodded. "Yes, not because I wanted to hide it." His voice remained calm. "Because I knew what would happen when you learned." Grace laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "You mean this?" She gestured toward the article. "You mean realizing that the person funding all these projects may also be connected to the reasons they are needed?" Neither spoke for several seconds. The truth hung between them, uncomfortable, unavoidable. Finally, Sebastian stepped closer. "The city is not divided into heroes and villains, Grace. That sounds convenient, it sounds true." His gaze remained steady. "I inherited systems that existed long before I had control of them." Grace folded her arms. "And what did you do with that control?" For the first time since she had met him, Sebastian looked genuinely tired. Not physically, emotionally, like a man carrying something for years without finding a place to set it down. "Some things I changed," he said quietly. "Some things I did not change fast enough." Grace looked away. Through the window, distant lights shimmered across the darkness. Everything suddenly felt more complicated than before. She understood now why Sebastian had noticed her. She understood why the photograph mattered. She understood why his mother's memory remained at the center of everything he built. But she also understood something else. The empire funding her work was not built entirely on noble intentions. It carried scars, history, mistakes. And standing in that quiet house, surrounded by memories of a woman who believed nobody should be forgotten, Grace realized she faced a choice she had never expected. Because the question was no longer why Sebastian had chosen her. The question was whether she could still trust him after learning the truth. Every meaningful choice eventually demands a price. Rain covered Manhattan in a curtain of silver as Grace Morgan stepped out of the train station and into the cold evening. Headlights blurred across wet streets. Umbrellas moved through the city like dark floating shadows, yet none of it distracted her from the conversation she had left behind. For 3 days she had avoided Sebastian Romano. She answered messages from project managers. She attended planning meetings. She reviewed budgets and construction schedules. But every time his name appeared on her phone screen, she ignored it. The problem was not that she believed he had lied. The problem was that he had told the truth too late. The shelters were real. The community centers were real. The lives being improved were real. Yet so was the history. So were the decisions that had helped create the problems they were now trying to solve. Grace found herself questioning everything. Had she become part of something larger than she understood? Had her work been used to repair a reputation rather than repair communities? The questions followed her everywhere. On Thursday evening, a message finally arrived that she could not ignore. Meet me, 1 hour. No presentations, no proposals, just the truth. The location was a rooftop garden atop an office building overlooking Midtown. Grace almost deleted the message. Instead, she found herself stepping into the elevator an hour later. The doors opened onto a quiet terrace suspended above the city. Rain had stopped. The pavement still glistened beneath rows of soft amber lights. Beyond the railing, thousands of windows illuminated the darkness like stars. Sebastian stood alone near the edge. No assistants, no security, no meetings, just him. For a moment, neither spoke. The city hummed below them. Finally, Grace broke the silence. Why now? Sebastian looked out across the skyline. Because you deserve an answer. I deserved 1 week ago. You are right. The admission surprised her. There was no defense in his voice, no argument, only acceptance. Grace folded her arms. Then answer me. Sebastian nodded slowly. The projects we are building will help people. I know. The funding is real. I know. And the history is real too. Grace looked away. The honesty somehow hurt more than excuses would have. Sebastian continued. When I inherited control, I convinced myself that protecting what existed was the responsible thing to do. His gaze remained fixed on the city lights. Then years passed. Rainwater dripped quietly from nearby branches. The system kept generating success. Revenue, growth, influence, he paused. And every year it became harder to change. Grace listened carefully. So why change now? For the first time, Sebastian looked directly at her. Because eventually you have to decide whether you own your success or your success owns you. The words settled heavily between them. Grace could see the exhaustion behind his calm expression now. Not physical exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone standing between two versions of himself. What happens if you keep everything exactly as it is? She asked. Sebastian answered immediately. The empire grows. And what happens if you change it? A faint smile appeared. Not happy, not sad, simply honest. I lose a great deal. Grace studied him. Money? Some. Power? Some. Influence? Probably. The city wind moved through the rooftop garden. Somewhere below, a siren echoed briefly through the streets. Then why would you do it? Sebastian's answer came quietly. Because my mother spent her life trying to build the kind of city we keep talking about. His eyes never left hers. And because I am tired of standing in the way of it. For several seconds, Grace could not speak. Then her phone vibrated. An incoming email notification flashed across the screen. She glanced down automatically. The sender was Romano Holdings. Attached was a document marked for immediate release. She opened it. Her eyes widened. Asset transfers, property divestments, entire revenue streams scheduled for liquidation. The numbers were staggering. Slowly she looked up. You already made the decision. Sebastian nodded once. Yesterday, the skyline shimmered behind him. The future he had controlled for years was already beginning to disappear. And for the first time, Grace realized there was no path where Sebastian Romano could keep both the empire he inherited and the man he wanted to become. Change does not happen the moment a decision is made. Change begins when the consequences arrive. The announcement shook the city within 48 hours. Financial newspapers published headlines. Business analysts debated motives. Investors speculated behind closed doors. Entire divisions of Romano Holdings were being restructured, sold, or redirected toward community development initiatives that many experts considered financially irrational. Grace Morgan watched the reaction unfold from a conference room overlooking a construction site in Brooklyn. Outside the windows, steel beams rose into the grey winter sky. Workers moved across scaffolding. Concrete trucks rumbled through the streets below. Inside the room, several project directors reviewed updated budgets that had suddenly doubled in size. New housing programs were approved. Educational grants expanded, medical outreach units received permanent funding. The scale of transformation was difficult to comprehend, yet beneath the optimism, Grace sensed tension. Not everyone supported the changes. By late afternoon, she arrived at Romano headquarters for a scheduled meeting. The building felt different from her previous visits. Conversations stopped when she passed. Employees exchanged careful glances. Even the reception area carried a strange stillness. The elevator carried her toward the executive floor. As the doors opened, she immediately understood why. A board meeting had just ended. Men and women in expensive suits exited the conference room with expressions ranging from frustration to disbelief. Nobody appeared pleased. Through the glass walls, she could see Sebastian Romano standing alone at the far end of the room. The skyline stretched behind him beneath a blanket of winter clouds. For a moment, he simply stared out across Manhattan. The posture was familiar, calm, controlled, yet something had changed. The weight he carried seemed visible now. Grace entered quietly. Sebastian turned toward her. "How bad was it?" she asked. A faint smile appeared. "You assume it was bad." "I saw the faces in the hallway. Then yes." He walked toward the conference table. Documents remained scattered across its polished surface: financial projections, property assessments, transition plans. Entire sections were highlighted in red. Grace recognized enough to understand the scale of the sacrifice. Some of the most profitable divisions were disappearing entirely. "They tried to stop you." Sebastian nodded. "Most people do not willingly dismantle systems that generate success." Grace studied the papers. "And you refused?" The answer came without hesitation. Outside, snow began falling beyond the windows. Large flakes drifted slowly between skyscrapers. The city seemed quieter than usual. Grace looked at him carefully. "Do you regret it?" Sebastian glanced toward the skyline again. "Ask me in 10 years. She laughed softly. To her surprise, so did he. The moment felt lighter than anything they had shared in weeks. Then his expression grew serious once more. "Do you remember what you asked me on the rooftop?" Grace nodded. "What happens if you change everything? I have my answer now." His voice remained calm. "You discover who actually believed in the mission." Silence settled between them. Grace understood immediately. The resistance had not come from strangers. It had come from people who benefited from the old structure. People who preferred certainty over responsibility. People who saw communities as numbers rather than neighbors. Sebastian looked down at the city below. "For years I thought leadership meant preserving what existed." He paused. "I was wrong." Grace stepped closer. "What does it mean now?" Snow continued falling outside. White against glass, white against steel, white against the endless movement of Manhattan. Sebastian watched it for several seconds before answering. "Building something worth leaving behind." The words lingered in the room long after he spoke them, and for the first time since she had entered his world, Grace realized she was no longer witnessing a wealthy man funding change. She was witnessing a man becoming someone entirely different. Then Sebastian reached into a folder resting on the table and slid a set of architectural renderings toward her. Grace looked down. Her eyes widened instantly because the largest project in the entire portfolio was no longer a commercial development. It was something else, something built exactly where everything had started. The first brick is never just a brick. It is a decision made visible. 3 months later, spring arrived in New York with cautious optimism. Patches of green appeared in city parks. Trees began reclaiming their color. The bitter winter winds that had dominated the skyline slowly surrendered to warmer air. Grace Morgan stood at the edge of a construction site beneath a bright blue sky, watching workers install the final glass panels on a building that had once existed only as lines on an architectural drawing. The transformation felt almost impossible. What had started as an abandoned stretch of land near the overpass was now becoming something entirely different. Classrooms, counseling offices, medical facilities, community kitchens, recreational spaces, every floor had been designed around a simple idea: nobody should be forgotten. The words appeared engraved near the main entrance. Grace traced her fingers across the lettering as volunteers carried supplies through the open doors behind her. Laughter echoed through hallways that had not existed a year earlier. Children chased one another across freshly landscaped walkways. Parents stopped to admire murals painted by local artists. For the first time, the future felt tangible, real, not because funding had appeared, not because buildings were rising, because people had begun believing again. A movement had replaced a project. Later that afternoon, Grace walked through the completed facility with Sebastian Romano. Sunlight streamed through towering windows, illuminating spaces that would soon serve thousands of families every year. They moved slowly through the building, pausing occasionally to watch volunteers preparing classrooms and organizing donation drives. The atmosphere felt different from anything they had experienced before, lighter, honest, earned. Sebastian stopped beside a second-floor window overlooking the city. From there they could see the overpass in the distance where everything had begun. Cars moved steadily along the roadway. Pedestrians crossed intersections below. Life continued as it always had, yet somehow the city looked different. "Do you remember the first time you brought me to one of your projects?" Grace asked. Sebastian smiled faintly. "You accused me of being suspicious. To be fair, that is probably true," she laughed softly. The sound echoed through the nearly finished hallway. For a moment neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable now, not awkward, not uncertain. The kind of silence built over time, built through trust, built through difficult truths. Grace looked out the window again. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you kept driving that night?" Sebastian's expression grew thoughtful. He understood immediately which night she meant. The cold evening beneath the overpass, the final meal, the boy named Ethan, the beginning of everything. "Sometimes," he admitted, and he looked toward the community center below. Families were already gathering near the entrance, despite the building not officially opening until the next day. "I think I would have spent the rest of my life convincing myself I was too busy to stop." The honesty in his answer made Grace smile. Months earlier, she might have challenged him, questioned him, doubted him. Now she simply nodded, because she believed him. Outside, volunteers began arranging chairs for the grand opening ceremony scheduled for the following morning. Reporters arrived. Community leaders gathered. Families lined up to tour the facility. The excitement spread through the neighborhood like sunlight after a long winter. As evening approached, Grace and Sebastian stepped onto the rooftop terrace overlooking the completed campus. Golden light stretched across the city. The skyline glowed. Somewhere below, children laughed as they explored a playground that had not existed 6 months earlier. Grace rested her hands against the railing and watched the scene unfold. Everything felt different from the day she first met him, different from the questions, different from the uncertainty, different from the distance that once separated their worlds. Then Sebastian reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small velvet box. Grace turned toward him, surprised. The city lights flickered on one by one behind them, and as the sun disappeared beyond the skyline, she realized the final chapter of one story was ending at the exact moment another was about to begin. 5 years later, the bridge looked nothing like it had. On the night spring sunlight spilled across clean sidewalks where cracked pavement once stood. Young trees lined the streets. Murals brightened walls that had once been covered in fading graffiti. The temporary shelters were gone. In their place stood a thriving community campus connected to schools, medical clinics, job training centers, and family support programs that now served thousands of people every year. The transformation was so complete that newcomers to the neighborhood often struggled to believe what the area had looked like before. On a warm Saturday morning, laughter filled the air beneath the overpass. Volunteers arranged tables covered with food, fresh fruit, books, and donated supplies. Families gathered beneath colorful banners. Children chased one another through the crowd. Music drifted softly from speakers positioned near the entrance to the community center. Grace Morgan moved between tables greeting volunteers by name. Some had worked alongside her for years. Others were teenagers who had grown up benefiting from programs that now inspired them to give back. She smiled as she accepted a tray of sandwiches from one volunteer and carried it toward the serving line. Across the plaza, Sebastian Romano stood speaking with several community leaders. Time had changed him in ways money never could. The sharp edges that once defined him had softened. The authority remained. The confidence remained. But now people approached him without hesitation, not because they feared him, because they trusted him. When their eyes met across the crowd, a familiar smile passed between them. No words were needed. They had built this together, not perfectly, not easily, but honestly. A small voice suddenly interrupted Grace's thoughts. "Mom, can I do it now?" She looked down and laughed. Their 4-year-old son stood beside her, almost half his size. His dark hair moved in the spring breeze. His bright eyes carried traces of both parents. "Are you sure you are ready?" Grace asked. The boy nodded enthusiastically. "You promised." He hurried toward the serving table with the determined seriousness only children possess. Grace followed a few steps behind. Nearby, an elderly man approached the line carrying a worn backpack. The boy reached into the bag and carefully handed him a wrapped meal. "Have a good day, sir," he said proudly. The man's face softened immediately. "Thank you, young man." For a moment time seemed to slow, the sunlight, the laughter, the movement of the crowd. Everything blended together into a single image. Sebastian joined Grace quietly. Neither spoke as they watched their son return to the table for another meal package. Finally, Grace glanced toward him. "Do you remember?" Sebastian followed her gaze toward the exact spot beneath the overpass where a younger version of her had once handed away the final meal of the night. "Every day," he said softly. The answer carried no sadness, only gratitude. Around them, the neighborhood continued to live and breathe. Children ran through playgrounds that had not existed years earlier. Families walked safely through streets once forgotten by the rest of the city. Opportunities had replaced obstacles. Hope had replaced resignation. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but for more people than either of them had ever imagined possible. Grace rested her hand in Sebastian's. Together they watched the crowd moving beneath the spring sky. The empire he once thought defined him no longer existed in its old form. What remained was something far more valuable. Schools, homes, futures, second chances, the things his mother had dreamed about, the things Grace had always fought for. Their son laughed as he handed another meal to a stranger. The man thanked him, the boy smiled, and beneath the same bridge, where one small act of kindness had changed 2 lives forever, a new generation quietly carried that kindness forward. Because in the end, the greatest thing Sebastian Romano ever gave Grace was never an empire. It was a chance to help build a better world together.